Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. Today this will be part 2 of the To Find a Home series. This fic will be entitled To Take You Home. Shota wasn't surprised to see his husband vibrating in place as close to the door as he physically could be without scaring off the flight risk of a child that they were taking in. "Welcome home!" Mizuku stepped up to stand beside Shota, and although you could see his confusion at his English teacher's obvious excitement, he politely bowed. My apologies for intruding into your home." Shota whipped around so fast that his hair flew behind him. I get sworn at, but he gets my apologies for intruding into your home. The heck. Mizuku smirked but didn't manage to answer before Hisashi exclaimed, "Shota, no swearing in front of the baby." Mizuku's smirk quickly turned to a look of offended confusion. "Well, I was going to say it was because you were my favorite, but I'm not so sure now." He crossed his arms in front of his chest with a furrowed set of eyebrows. "I'm not a baby." And if inwardly he wanted to be cared for and loved like babies effortlessly were, then that was no one's business. Hisashi points at him. "It's your first day home. Therefore, 1-day anniversary of becoming our child. Therefore, our baby." "Zashi," Shota scolds sternly. "The kid hasn't even taken his shoes off yet. Don't scare him away already." The voice hero rocks back on his heels with a pout, but obliges. Mizuku still shoots him a narrowed glare before taking off his shoes. The flat wasn't too clean. Actually, it was a little messy, as you would expect from the home of a couple who had 5 jobs between them. Yet it still looked homely and warm and calm. The simple act of leaving his dirty, beat-up, quirkless shoes anywhere here, even if it was only in the Gunkan, would only make him feel like he was sullying a holy place. But no one was remarking on it, so he left his equally beat-up bag along with them, minimizing the infection as much as he could, and came in, following the couple in what turned out to be their kitchen. The table was set for 3 somehow, and Present Mike took the lonely plate onto one side to fill it with curry. He placed it back where it was, before with a quick inviting nod, having Izuku let him know that it was for him. He sat but didn't touch anything just yet. He had no doubt that this entire thing was strictly for him, since he would wager the 2 pro heroes didn't usually eat what would be surely a second dinner at 2 a.m. It made him want to cry, but not a single muscle of his face so much as twitched. Mike went to grab a plate on the other side, not Aizawa-sensei's since his head was currently smashed on his own, with a dramatic roll of his eyes. It was filled and brought to the table. He spied Izuku's still untouched plate. "You don't need to wait for us, Midoriya. Dig in." His smile was encouraging, but Izuku wasn't going to risk being impolite if it was simply said out of courtesy. He wouldn't usually get to eat until the next day anyway. He could wait a few more minutes, even if with the way the smell of spices awoke his stomach from its slumber. The plate Yamada was carrying was filled in much the same way as Izuku's own, but instead of putting it back where it was, he gently pulled his husband's forehead up until Aizawa was seated properly, and switched the empty plate for the one in his hand. Izuku wondered if his teacher was somehow sleeping with his eyes open, because they had this glassy look to him, like he wasn't really there. A worry only reinforced when his head was starting to fall back towards the table, and the now full plate of curry. Izuku gasped, and that seemed to be enough to bring his teacher back to a complete wakefulness mindset. He woke up mid-fall, as he straightened up in a single second and was carefully looking at his surroundings, looking for a threat, but only finding his student. He went back to his sleepy and confused state until he noticed his full plate and understood what had been about to happen, but only blinked slightly in realization, seemingly too tired to even care. Like he magically knew what his husband had almost done, Hisashi threw a suspicious glare at him, silently asking what he had done, but Aizawa expertly and innocently avoided his gaze, breaking out the tension by taking a hold of his chopsticks. That seemed to bring Hisashi back from his suspicious state as he whipped back towards Izuku, whose plate was still untouched, so he quickly took a seat, brought his hands together in thanks for the meal, and started to eat. Aizawa followed suit, and once both adults had started digging in, Izuku allowed himself to do the same. It was hard not to scarf down the entire plate as fast as physically possible. The habit of eating any food available as fast as he could in order to not have it be taken away was ingrained in him at this point. However, Izuku hadn't completely forgotten how to be a normal, functioning, civilized human being, and he made himself eat slowly, spoonful after spoonful. He was still the first to finish, but he'd put that on the fact that this was likely his teacher's second meal of the night. Yamada offered a second serving, but Izuku politely refused, against his better instincts. He had already eaten too much as it was, and he was pretty sure the couple wouldn't appreciate finding a plate full of food hidden beneath the bed the following morning. He knew he would have access to food. Probably. Hopefully. Izuku did not want to sully the place any longer, so he was thankful for the offer of a shower. When asked if he had any clean clothes to sleep in, he realized that his definition of clean and of sleeping clothes were probably not the same as theirs. It seemed that his hesitation was answer enough, as Aizawa disappeared before coming back with a t-shirt that would be big on him, but not comically so, and a pair of sweatpants that he could probably wear if he folded the waistband a few times. He nodded in thanks, but before he could take one more step, he was stopped. "Kid?" The gruff voice of his homeroom teacher made him pause, and his heart beat faster. This didn't sound like the good kind of tone. It sounded like the trouble kind of tone. He didn't turn around, but waited for what was to come. His breathing was perfectly measured. "Hand over your pack of cigarettes, please. Or packs, I guess." It seemed he had more to say, but his mouth didn't have time for anything more than opening once that he was interrupted by a choked-out gasp. They both turned towards Yamada, who had a shell-shocked look on his face and his mouth was wide open. Oh yeah, he hadn't met the real Izuku yet. He had even reflexively gone back into the polite, quiet, and meek, quirkless kid persona when he came in, so he was still thought to be an obedient, polite, and docile child. Aizawa rolled his eyes at his husband, though, like his surprise was as illogical as he claimed his students to be. "Hizashi, you literally tried smoking at his age." "Once!" the blond man indignantly protested. "Only because you coughed so hard that you lost control of your quirk, and I had to erase it until you were no longer liable to cause an earthquake." He raised an unimpressed eyebrow at him. "And you would have tried again, if I hadn't threatened to tell your moms." Izuku was pretty sure that he heard low mumbles that sounded suspiciously like, "I knew I shouldn't have married a snitch." Now that it seemed like they had done their reminiscing for the night, their attention was finally back on their new charge. Izuku hadn't moved. Honestly, he didn't want to hand anything over, or to give up any of the freedoms that he had to fight tooth and nail to earn. Smoking might not be healthy, but he didn't do it nearly as much as he could, and it was one of the least harmful ways that he'd found to cope. His body was tense, almost ready to flee, fight and flight instincts warring inside of him. His decision-making was interrupted by the weary sigh of his homeroom teacher. "I'm not going to take them away, kid. I don't expect you to quit just because I told you to. But I do want to monitor how much you smoke and maybe try and reduce the amount." He hesitated. He didn't want to, but he also wanted a shower and a bed, and he didn't want to be restricted in any way. But going back to the street wouldn't be possible now that Yue was aware of the situation. He wanted to keep his unhealthy coping mechanism, but he also wanted to please his teachers who were doing more than even his mother had in a long time. Eventually he sighed but complied and dropped his pack into Aizawa's waiting hand. The man showed him where he was putting it, and that he could take some, but his consumption would be monitored to make sure he didn't harm his health too irreparably. Izuku nodded in understanding, unhappy as he was. He finally went to take a shower, which had been calling his name since he first stepped into the place. Hizashi decided that the dishes could wait when he saw his husband visibly deflate, almost swaying once they were alone. He went to embrace Shota from behind, allowing him to rest and to lean his weight against him. It was unusual for Shota to get like this. This was the bone-deep exhaustion of a long mission finally coming to an end, only for the outcome to be entirely unsatisfying. The situation did kind of feel like that. They found the kid, but the kid had been living on the streets like they thought, and he had been before they'd even noticed, and even after they had, when they couldn't manage to find them. Now he was in a place that he could hopefully call home soon, but how much damage had already been done? How much suffering has this child had to go through as he simply tried to live in a world that didn't want him to, in a world that actively tried to shun him, to kill him? Hizashi started humming softly, pressing his lips against the black-haired partner's neck. He knew the man found the vibration soothing, the tune too. He could feel months of worry and exhaustion visibly seep out of him. It was always a struggle for them to break apart when they found themselves in such a cozy and soothing embrace, but their kid needed a sense of normalcy, not like he was a burden to them at all. He couldn't see them being this weary the very first day he arrived. They'd be his rock, and they'd be each other's as well, in the privacy of their bedroom. Hisashi got started on the dishes as Shota set up the guest room. Hisashi didn't have time previously to set it up before they arrived, too busy getting a meal ready. Everything was ready by the time the kid left the shower. He made a stop at the living room where the couple was relaxing and reached for the cigarettes that he'd left there with his eyes, daring them to stop him. They didn't. He went outside on the balcony to smoke some. He normally wouldn't smoke more than one a night. Cigarettes were expensive, whether you bought or traded for them, so you didn't waste them. He wasn't wasting them right now, though. He needed the lightheadedness and the calm they brought him, even if only for a few minutes. Once he was done, he remained there, leaning against the balcony railing, looking out at the lit-up city in the dark. He was scared to go back inside, so he didn't. Smoking a second cigarette would just stress him out more once he finished it and had to go back inside and face his teachers. He pulled it out with shaking hands anyway. It didn't help any, and he had no idea what time it was, and as used as he was to missing sleep, the thought of a soft, warm bed was enticing enough to lead him back inside. Hopefully they didn't take the offer back. After placing his pack back where he took it from, he remained standing there awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot, unsure of what he was supposed to do, what he was allowed to do here. A voice came through the panicked haze. "Thank you, Midoriya." He didn't quite whip his head up, but it was close enough. His eyes were disbelieving, his mouth open until he caught himself and he closed it, narrowing his eyes at the same motion. He didn't understand why exactly he was being thanked here. For being a burden? For being homeless? For being incompetent enough that he had let enough of his situation show his worry to his teachers? For not being able to live by himself? He felt like the waste of space everyone always said he was. "I know it isn't easy, but we'll help you settle and give you the best care that we can." Izuku kept himself from saying that a bed, shower, and meals were already better than anything he's ever had, but decided not to let that information slip. Hisashi picked up where his husband left off with a bright smile and slightly bouncing in excitement on the couch. "That's right, kiddo. You're part of this family for as long as you want to be, and we'll be here for anything you need." Izuku felt his eyes burn, and cursed himself for even letting that much show, but at least he wasn't crying. He might let rivers of tears fall from his eyes when he was at UA, acting like a normally functioning human being and not the fucked-up, homeless, emotionally constipated mess that he really was, but true tears? He hadn't shed those in a long time. Aizawa picked back up where his partner left off. For more practical stuff they did need to address eventually. Somehow it suited them, Yamada bringing comfort with words and gestures, while Aizawa set up reliable and clear frameworks. "It's currently—" The man checks his phone only to scowl at it. 3:30 a.m. Hisashi let out an anguished wail next to him, and honestly Izuku would have followed him if he felt any less high-strung. Shota glared at the man by his side before accepting the losing battle that fighting his husband's dramatics was, and he just sighed. "And we usually leave at 7 a.m., so if you want to get ready for school, you'll have to wake up at 6 so that you can get ready and we can have breakfast. Considering everything, we can excuse you from class tomorrow, but—" Shota didn't even have to say it was up to him that the kid had whipped his head up and exclaimed, "No!" The outburst almost seemed to have surprised Izuku more than it had them, as he took a fearful step back, even though he had already been long out of reach. He continued more evenly. "I mean, no, it's okay. I can go to school, please." Shota just grunts. This was honestly within his expectations, and he was sure the kid had gone to school in worse conditions before, so they'd just have to make do with making him get enough sleep the following day. To each day its own fight. And today had been the first of a very, very long list of issues they had to fix that the child probably didn't even realize he had and wouldn't want to let go of. They had him home, and that was good enough for now. With a nod from Shota and a hair ruffle from Hisashi, they bid him good night, for the meager 3 hours of sleep that they'd be getting at the most, and Izuku could lay down in a comfortable bed for the first time in years. You'd think that laying on what was certainly the most comfortable bed he'd ever have the pleasure of finding would have let him have the most restful sleep that he'd had in a while, but it didn't. It really didn't. Instead, the comfiness almost felt wrong, like a trap waiting to close in on him the moment that he allowed himself to relax, so he just didn't. He laid awake for however long it took him to hear movements from another room before he got up. He usually arrived the moment the gates opened. The school was always more comfortable than wherever he was sleeping at the time. Another reason he arrived so early was that he didn't want to dirty or mess up his uniform while he was out, so he just left it in his locker and changed on site. Considering where the flat was located, they'd be at school at 7:30 if they drove, an hour earlier than classes started, but not early enough that no student would be present. Well, only Ida would normally care about him not being in his uniform the moment he was inside, but he tended to arrive early, so with his luck he would bump into him. He gritted his teeth and prepared for the embarrassed smile and awkward apologies that he'd have to use to defend himself while the boy berated him for something that was none of his business. He didn't hate Ida. He was just overbearing and stiff. But he was supposed to blend in with the crowd and with people who would have never gotten in trouble so willingly, so he couldn't be blamed for whatever rules they'd break. Well, that was what he thought, but when the guy just had to try and murder a serial killer in plain daylight and while on internships on top of it, maybe hanging out with Kaminari would have been less risky, actually. He was a moron, but at least he wasn't that big of a moron. He shook his head, dislodging the thought. Honestly, he was jealous of Tokiyami and Shoji, who could afford to be alone because they were strong enough to defend themselves, even against a big group of attackers. Being alone made you a target, and there were too many people who wouldn't mind taking aim at the quirkless. Even though he could fight, there was only so much he could do when he was being held down by 3 people while another 4 kicked and spat at him in turns. He couldn't even protect his ribs or his head, so it always led to way more serious injuries than he had to fix. Yeah, he could bear with Ida for safety's sake, and then he could just go off and be on his own as soon as he'd graduate. Once he was dressed and ready to go, something that didn't take longer than 5 minutes, he sat at the dining table and watched as Yamada cooked breakfast for all 3 of them. Well, hopefully. He got a bright smile along with a cheerful "good morning" that almost blinded him. How could someone be awake so early? He groaned and laid his head on the table, taking advantage of every single second of shut-eye he could get. Aizawa did pretty much the same as him until his considerate other half had brought him some coffee with a snicker. Only then did he raise his head and attempt to even boot up his brain. The glaze his eyes had it lifted slightly at the smell, and almost completely after a few sips of the beverage. He was pretty sure the coffee was the only reason his teacher would be the slightest bit awake by the time they left. He refused the one he was offered. How could someone drink Satan's beverage when there was perfectly good hot chocolates that you could top with marshmallows, whipped cream, and caramel? Okay, so maybe he'd never had one of those, but there was no way it wasn't better than that disgusting bean juice. Izuku could barely stomach breakfast after he'd had dinner the day before. Wait, wasn't that only a few hours ago? Honestly, he wouldn't even feel hungry for at least a couple of days. Not that he wouldn't be able to eat, but he wouldn't actually need to. He definitely would, though. After eating so fast Izuku worried that his English teacher would choke, the man disappeared into his bedroom, probably to style the horrendous thing he called hair while in his hero costume. He had so many questions about that. Aizawa washed the dishes while he awkwardly watched. They were off at 7 on the dot, and he had to avoid the worried glances of the voice hero that he threw his way the entire way to UA. He was looking at him through the center mirror. Usually making it to the school left him giddy and excited to finally be in his safe place, but right now, he wanted to run away. Too many changes, too fast. He sighed as he hyped himself up. He didn't want to smile. Didn't want to hunch over when people got too close to appear meek and fearful. Didn't want to fake a stutter and portray a lack of confidence that he'd gotten rid of within a month of living in the dark and dangerous alleyways of the city's worst neighborhoods. Didn't want to play the weak, hopeful, optimistic kid who died months ago alone on a lonely rooftop. But he braced himself as he exited the car, and the moment that they reached the school entrance, through the teacher's parking garage, he took a deep breath, lightly bouncing on the balls of his feet a few times, and put on the wide, innocent smile that everyone believed to be real. He took off in an excited trot, only pausing long enough to turn back and wave brightly at his new guardians. "Have a good day, senseis." He didn't miss Aizawa's unhappy scowl and the furrow of his eyebrows, nor Yamada's startled and worried expression. Not unexpected for people who were witnessing the switch between his fake persona and his real persona for the first time. Keeping up the act would be harder today, somehow. He could feel it. The mask cracking. All right, everyone. This concludes part 2 of the To Find a Home series. Part 3 will be next, and as always, thank you all so much for listening.